This is Inside PHLCouncil, bringing you the latest news from Philadelphia City Council, straight from the source. Inside PHLCouncil is hosted by Joe Grace and Patty Gillett.
Hi, I'm Joe Grace, City Council's Communications Director.
Hi, I'm Patty Gillett, Council's Deputy Communications Director. Welcome back to Inside PHLCouncil.
Patty, I say it every week. There's a lot going on, so we're going to get right to it. It's home stretch time for this term of council. Tax abatement reform. After years of talking about it, council finally introduced legislation that looks like it's moving. Homestead exemption. Homeowners struggling with rising property taxes because of assessments through no fault of their own. They have some relief coming, we hope. The Safe Havens law to prohibit guns in city rec centers gets approved. And a bill that will jumpstart the cleaning of neighborhood business corridors was passed too. Let's get going. Where do you want to start first?
Let's start with tax abatements. We've been talking about it for years. Council's been talking about it. It looks like reform to the tax abatement law is finally coming. After months of debate, other bills and studies of the city's real estate tax abatement and lots of discussion, legislation was introduced in council to amend the tax abatement law using a phased-down approach that will reduce it by 10% annual increments over the next decade. The proposed change in the abatement was introduced by Councilmember Bass on behalf of Council President Clark, and it focuses exclusively on the construction of new residential dwellings on vacant land. The changes will not impact abatements on commercial projects or rehabs of existing residents in our neighborhoods.
Good.
So after the bill was introduced, Council President Clark said the change in the abatement law is expected to generate anywhere from $275 million to $300 million over the next decade in additional revenue, and that revenue will go towards the school district and towards badly needed city services. Clark said that we need to inject more equity into the abatement system, and that's one of the driving forces behind this change, right, and this change at this time. So now at the same session where Councilmember Bass introduced the abatement reform bill, Councilmember Kenyatta Johnson introduced a companion bill that would increase the city's existing homestead exemption for homeowners by an additional $5,000. And that is expected to impact 220,000 homeowners in Philadelphia. Okay, and Council President Clark commented on that bill's purpose. He said we need to do something for existing homeowners who are experiencing rising property values and higher property assessments and thus higher taxes through no fault of their own.
Interesting.
So next week we'll be catching up on how these reform bills are doing legislative-wise and what the impact of these bills is expected to be. But things are moving pretty quickly on that.
I can't wait to get into that with you next week. Let's keep moving. Amid this seeming never-ending wave of gun violence in our city, Council took some action at this session on the issue of guns in city playgrounds, didn't it? Tell us about this Safe Havens law. What is it?
Yes, they did. And if you're a listener of this podcast regularly, this is not the first time you're hearing about the Safe Havens law, but it finally passed last week. Council approved the law, and it's designed to keep guns and other deadly weapons out of city recreation centers and playgrounds. This is in response to a number of shootings and other incidents that have basically marred these places that are supposed to be peaceful places where children and adults can play.
Right.
This law was, again, also introduced by Councilmember Bass on behalf of Council President Clark. And it does require enabling authorization from Harrisburg to become effective because, as we've said on the podcast, the state preempts any regulations of guns. So basically anything involving guns needs to come from the state. So legislators from Philadelphia are working on getting the enabling language approved in Harrisburg, but that is kind of an uphill battle because overall in Pennsylvania, there is a pro-gun sentiment once you get outside of Philadelphia,
yep, and
to some degree Pittsburgh as well. Council President Clark alluded to this uphill battle when he spoke to the press after the law passed, and here's what he said. We're working with the state, hopefully, to get enabling legislation passed. We cannot sit idly by and do nothing in the meantime. We have to hope that Harrisburg realizes the importance of saving children's lives at playgrounds. If they can't see the wisdom in that, heaven help us.
You know, it was an eloquent comment by him. I don't know whether Harrisburg's listening. What I do know is that City Council is leaning in and trying to do things, working with police, working with the mayor's office on other anti-violence programs. So we're just going to keep doing everything that we can. Let's switch gears. Council took some other action about cleaning up neighborhood business corridors. I'll take that one, Patty. It's called PHL Taking Care of Business, and it is the brainchild of Councilmember Sherelle Parker. It's part of a series of mid-year budget transfer ordinances to fund various city projects supported by Council and the Mayor's Office. Council approved a $10 million program to fund the cleaning of neighborhood business corridors citywide. And as I say, this was sponsored by Councilmember Parker. It's modeled on a successful effort that she's already doing in her Northwest Philadelphia district. I think that's the 9th district. This is a collaborative effort. It's going to involve PIDC, our Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, some other nonprofit entities that will clean the neighborhood business corridors. Now, Parker estimates, Patty, that each council district's business corridors might hire as many as 40 part-time workers to clean the corridors in jobs paying a living wage and with health benefits. This effort, interestingly, has the support of Mayor Kenny, City Council, and also the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Philadelphia. Interesting, huh?
Those are three entities that don't always agree at the same time, so that's very interesting. But I think that on this particular issue, something that makes our commercial corridors, our neighborhood commercial corridors, more inviting and thus more likely for people to shop local is something that they can't disagree with.
Which I suspect is why they got the Chamber to support it. Patty, at the beginning of this council meeting that we're talking about, something nice happened involving a retiring member of council. And I know you are a real supporter of his work. Tell us what happened.
Yes, Councilmember Greenlee, who is retiring at the end of this term, is a steadfast, earnest member of this council, and we're really going to miss him. He's been the kind of quiet, effective, progressive member of council for some time, and this is third or fourth term right now that's coming to an end. He's perhaps best known for his work over a number of years to see a paid sick leave ordinance approved by council. After several attempts that were blocked by the business community and frankly prior mayoral administrations, the ordinance was enacted and is now Philadelphia law. And we're going to talk a little bit about that fight for the paid sick leave ordinance a little bit later when we talk to Greenlee in our interview portion of this segment. But
can't wait.
But that's what he's best known for. But for this and many other progressive efforts on behalf of Philadelphians, Greenlee was honored before council in the caucus room by a large group of advocates for other progressive causes. That includes Community Legal Services, the Domestic Workers Alliance, who were actually just here a few weeks ago for the Domestic Workers Bill. So they came back to council to just basically show their appreciation for Councilmember Greenlee. A large crowd in council's caucus room stood and applauded after he received the recognition and an award. It was a very nice moment. It was a surprise for him. A bunch of us knew that it was happening, but he didn't know. And it was a richly deserved moment for him, especially he's not the kind of guy to seek attention, so it was a nice moment.
You know what's really nice about that? It wasn't scripted at all. And
No.
you could tell.
Yeah, I had a camera on him, and he was very surprised.
I really look forward to doing the next part of this podcast with you, which is the interview with Councilman Greenlee.
That's awesome. All right, thanks, Joe. The next stated meeting of City Council will take place on December 12th at 10 a.m. in council chambers on the 4th floor of City Hall. This is the last meeting of this term in City Council, so if you can't get here in person, you'd probably want to watch this one along on TV. But if you can get here in person, this would probably be the one to get to, since it's going to be pretty monumental as we say goodbye to 4 departing members.
It's going to be pretty interesting.
It's going to be interesting. So, but again, if you can't watch in person, watch us live on Xfinity Channel 64, Fios Channel 40, or on phlcouncil.com/watch to stream. And then you'll also want to read our weekly report on Friday the 13th. We usually get that up by noon on Fridays.
Friday the 13th, I hope you're not jinxing us. I'll put in at the end here a little plug for our growing listenership on our podcast. Read the weekly report. Go on our website and read it, as Patty just asked you to do. A lot of work goes into it. There's video, there's photographs, there's real content, and we're trying to build an audience for, this is our digital version of the news of what's happening in Philadelphia's legislative body. Patty, thanks.
Thanks for the plug, Joe.
Like what you're hearing? Be sure to subscribe to Inside PHL Council on your favorite podcast app.
We're here with Councilmember Bill Greenlee, and welcome back to Inside PHL Council. Councilmember, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Joe and Patty.
We're really happy to be here with you, and we're going to, as we like to say, dig right in.
Absolutely.
So as we record this, you're just, as we were just chatting, maybe 6 weeks away from the end of a long, distinguished career in City Hall. It began in 1980 when you were a staffer to Councilmember David Cohen, then as a member in your own right, starting in 2006. A few weeks ago, Councilmember Derek Green, another staffer who became a council member, commented you can always tell which members had been staffers first. Do you agree with that?
I do, because obviously we every day have been working here in council, know how the place works, know the idiosyncrasies and whatever. And I think what's important is we I think can help other council members that have just come in, because a lot of people, you know, we lived this stuff every day. They didn't. So when they come in, I think a lot of times they'll turn to us to try to get some guidance on just really general things. You know, introducing a bill, how you go about requesting certain things, that type of thing. So I think I agree with Derek. I think you can tell, yes.
So that's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
We thought you might say that, but we weren't really sure. So you announced your decision not to run for re-election earlier this year. Talk to us about that a little bit. Was it a decision a long time coming? We've known a lot of elected officials. You've been one yourself. Talk to us a little bit about what factors you had to think about when making this obviously, pretty important decision for yourself and for City Council.
Yeah, when I got reelected in 2015, I have to say it already entered my mind. Was I ready after these 4 years for another 4 years? And the biggest thing I had to decide as time went on over the last few years was I going to be all in on a campaign? Because I thought it was only fair if I was going to run, not just fair to myself, but fair to people who were supporting me, my staff members, all, that I had to be all in. And all in meant 3-4 meetings a night, maybe, a lot of phone calls, a lot of fundraising, which is, I don't know what my strengths are exactly, but I know what one isn't, and that's fundraising. I don't like it. I really got pushed every Friday or so to do the call time when I ran before. Had to hire somebody to kind of push me like in 2015 to do it. So I just had to determine to myself, was I ready to do that again? It might sound strange. I might have been ready for another 4 years, but I wasn't ready for those 6 to 9 months of campaigning. And when I put it all together, as time slowly went on, I leaned more and more towards probably not running, and I kind of intimated that to people that I know. But I didn't want to close the door until probably the beginning of this year. And then it was time to finally make a decision. And I realized, as I said before, I just wasn't going to be all in. And again, you got to be all in when you're running citywide for council, especially in a Democratic primary where there's sometimes 30 to 40 people running. Right. And again, I just decided that it was time. I thought, did my part in here. It was. I just think when it was all thought out, it was the right time for me to step aside.
Did you feel a sense of relief when you made the decision and announced the decision?
I did, because then the door was closed, if you will. I knew it was, I wasn't going to go back and say, by the way, I changed my mind. Plus any supporters I might have had were already moving somewhere else. I know that.
Yeah.
So, and it did. It was a relief. Again, I think most people close to me knew it was coming, but I wanted to be, I kept that door open just a tad, just to make sure that one day I didn't wake up one morning and, the urge hit me again, but it just never really did. I loved what I was doing, but like I said, I just didn't feel I could be all in for a campaign.
You mentioned in that answer doing your part, that you've done your part. And so let's get into how you've done your part in terms of legislation. One of the key pieces of legislation credited to you in your time here in council is Philadelphia's paid sick leave law, which took effect in 2015 after a very lengthy 7 years lengthy legislative battle. At the time of the bill signing, you said, the people who don't have paid sick leave are the people who need it the most. They're low-income workers, single mothers, they're college students, or people just starting out in the workforce. Can you talk to us about why it took 7 years to get this legislation passed in Philadelphia, and what you learned from that long fight?
It was certainly a controversial measure when we put it in. The mayor, then Michael Nutter, made it clear he was not in support. The administration was very much opposed to it. Business people, Chamber of Commerce fought it very hard, as did a lot of other people. And I think, as usual, when there's legislation like this, what I call the worst case scenarios come up. What if there's an Eagles game that runs late the night before? Isn't everybody going to take that next day off? That kind of argument. And the one good thing we had, there was a couple other cities, one first, San Francisco, who had done it already, and they found that those worst case scenarios didn't come out. That it wasn't the end of the world, as I'd like to say. But it really was literally convincing one person at a time, one council member at a time. It was a tough road, and probably it was one of the most lobbied against bills that at least I've seen since we've been in city council. And but in fairness, there was also a lot of people, grassroots folks, who were out there every day pushing it too. And I think we helped each other in that sense, because there were times where I get a little discouraged because, as you know, we passed it twice and Mayor Nutter vetoed it, and we weren't able to override the veto. And, that gets discouraging after a while, after all those years. But the advocates just said, we're not going to give up. And I said, we're not going to give up. And we just kept at it. But I also think it shows how compromise is very important in government and getting legislation done. Because I think in the end, we were somewhere around 37 to 39 amendments, which sounds crazy, but that's what we did over the year, the changes. And most of those changes were things that businesses had requested or suggested. And a lot of them were good suggestions. I mean, we never said when we put the bill in that it was a perfect bill. And we had lots of meetings with people. Oftentimes, some of those meetings meant we sat there and got shouted at and told we were socialists and all that kind of thing. But slowly, I think we were able to win people over. I mean, there were some folks who were never going to be convinced. But finally, we were, and I think that people who were opposing it slowly saw also that we were working up that support. And in the end, the bill passed 14-2. So, I mean, it was a real victory once we got it. And obviously, when it takes that long to do something, you feel particular satisfaction when it gets done. But the bottom line was, and you used that quote that I had, I just think government's supposed to be about trying to help people. And, we can't do everything for financial and other reasons. But I just thought this one made a lot of sense. And I think it's grown as the time has gone on around the country. Interesting enough, when it passed, or right around the time it passed, we were having the Democratic Convention in here, and one of the platforms in the Democratic Convention was paid sick leave. So it was something that was certainly not some out-of-the-way crazy idea. It was out there around the country, and now I forget how many states and cities now have it, but I don't know if I'd say it's the norm, but it's certainly not abnormal to have paid sick leave.
And it hasn't been the end of the world.
And it certainly hasn't been the end of the world. And that is funny. A lot of times with legislation, this a good example of it. We hear how bad it's going to be and all the terrible repercussions it's going to have, and then it doesn't have it. And sometimes, and I always said, look, if there was a problem with this bill or any bill that we did, and it turned out that there was some unforeseen problem, we could always put in another bill to make changes in that. Most of the time, we haven't been able to do that because, again, just on another bill that I put in years ago, it gave victims of domestic violence unpaid leave to just take care, to maybe get to a shelter, to get medical help, that kind of thing. And amazingly, the chamber came in and others and said how terrible this was going to be, how people were going to take advantage of it. And I said, you obviously don't understand the issue. The issue isn't that domestic violence victims fake injuries or problems. They usually don't tell people about them. That's and one of the reasons was because we didn't, they were afraid of losing their job. And again, it was the end of the world kind of thing, what the message was sending to businesses. I checked periodically. We have never heard one complaint from a business saying that somebody was taking advantage of this program. Now, I can't say nobody ever did, but we've certainly never heard about it. And we haven't really heard about anybody taking advantage of paid sick leave.
This is something you brought up not too long ago, Joe, is that somebody needs to do a study, a paid sick leave study on Philadelphia, like to show exactly what's happened since the bill. And I think it'll be borne out.
Yeah, I think so. I just think it just wasn't the problem people said it was going to be.
I want to ask the council member to elaborate on that, because Patty gave me an opening. We've both been around a while. There's always resistance to change. And in your experience, in your career, you just talked about it with paid sick leave. Does it often happen that after the change happens, all the terribilizing that happened about a piece of legislation doesn't come to pass?
Absolutely. I would say overwhelmingly, we never hear a complaint about a bill that we did. I mean, a real complaint. There is this general council is anti-business kind of thing. But when you bring up specific, well, what of the things we've done, what are the big problems? Most of the time, now, we hear about the soda tax. We do hear about that. People say it's bad, and there's a controversy about whether some of the figures they're saying are as bad as what they are. But on general issues like paid sick leave and domestic violence leave and that kind of thing, wage theft, we haven't heard anything. And I got to think if there was a real problem, we'd be hearing about it, you know. So I think it's, you know, I always quote former Councilwoman Tasco, who, and this was during sick leave, and it had to do with the end of the world kind of thing. She said, you know, many times we sat here over the years and heard how the end of the world was going to happen. And Lord, I sit here today and the world hasn't ended. And, you know, and Lord, we've sat here. I've been around for 40 years and the world hasn't ended. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's a good memory of Councilwoman Tasco, actually.
Yeah.
So in addition to paid sick leave, we've touched on this in some of your answers. You're also known for sponsorship or co-sponsorship of other progressive legislation that's passed through this chamber. Wage theft, which you just mentioned, Fair Work Week, last month's Domestic Workers Bill of Rights bill, which I understand you were very active behind the scenes on that as well, and last spring's ban on cashless retail. Now, what I specifically want to do is drill down on the cashless retail bill, because that faced a lot of pushback from corporations like Amazon. And then it also received a great deal of international attention. You were doing interviews with news outlets in Japan and in Europe, you know, on this cashless bill. So talk to us about the origins of the cashless ban legislation and the kind of pushback you received.
Yeah, the cashless ban is an interesting subject, because I did not think when I first put the bill in, it was that big a deal. You know, all we were saying was the businesses should be able to, people should be able to use the currency of the United States of America. And I just didn't think it was that big a deal either way. So I was somewhat surprised, although not really surprised, that businesses were opposing, because they kind of oppose anything that we try to put in to regulate businesses, usually using the general, you know, we're anti-business argument. But where I was really surprised was the positive response that I got. You mentioned these other countries' media, but just people on the street coming up and saying, you know, who didn't know me personally, and saying, you know, that's a good bill. That's ridiculous that I can't go in and get a cup of coffee unless I have, you know, a credit card. And so I was more surprised by how much it positively resonated with people than I was negatively, you know. And, you know, it was just one of those things. It was probably the most, as far as the response I got, negative but particularly positive, it was the most surprising thing I ever did. Like, you know, when you do paid sick leave or some of these other things, you know you're going to get pushback, and you know there's people supporting it. Because this wasn't something that people came to me and said, look, I think this is a good idea. I literally, one of my staff members said, yeah, I went to this place, and I had to have a credit card to pay for, I think it was a salad. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And we looked into it a little bit, saw that there was a little bit of energy generating out there in the country to push back on this, and I put in the bill, and it literally kind of exploded since. I'm still surprised. It's something that people still talk about to me more than anything else, more than paid sick leave, for example, which is just kind of surprising. It's just something that hit a nerve with people for whatever reason. I think they saw it as like an elitist thing that, people couldn't use, couldn't use cash. So that was just kind of interesting, so.
I just want to say a little editorial privilege. It is interesting to hear you talk about your reasoning behind these bills. I've watched you, covered you, interacted with you from different perches over the years, and it's just really interesting to hear you explain your thought process behind some of these important pieces of legislation. Little editorial privilege. Let me switch gears with you a little bit. So we've talked about successful legislation that you've moved through. We just want to talk with you a little bit about a pretty publicized bill that did not succeed yet. Last year, you and Councilmember Bass co-sponsored legislation that would have required pharmaceutical salespeople to register with the city and submit drug sales, pharmaceutical sales, and marketing materials for city review. Talk to us about your intent behind that bill and the kind of pushback you got.
Yeah, it's probably the most frustrating thing I was involved with in the 13 years here. It was one of the few times I got real emotional on the floor because I just thought, I still to this day don't understand the opposition to that bill, particularly. I understand why the pharmaceutical companies were opposed to it. I guess I didn't understand some of both the members' opposition and some of the other opposition that came in through here. I mean, the idea was basically, and this was something that we had talked to the health commissioner about, was that it was pretty clear evidence that, well, first of all, that we have an addiction problem in the city of Philadelphia, particularly opioids, but beyond opioids. There's an addiction issue. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. You don't even have to go to Kensington. Just walk on Chestnut Street and see the folks laying around with their dogs and stuff. A lot of that is an addiction issue. So the bill was reasonably simple, in my opinion. It just basically banned a pharmaceutical rep from giving a gift to a doctor in any kind, tickets, dinners, any of that kind of thing. Thinking that, and there was evidence that showed when doctors got some kind of gratuities, they wrote more prescriptions, and that didn't mean every doctor was for sale, but it just, why not take that at least image away that there was this problem? And I think it was more than an image. I think it was a reality. And then it had a couple more things in it, but that was the big thing. And I said about paid sick leave having maybe one of the most lobbied efforts, and that was certainly over years, but maybe the most intense right away lobbying effort against it was against any bill I did was the pharmaceutical bill. They had folks coming in here and were adamant to how terrible this was going to be. And they mixed it in, and this is what I think finally killed the bill, is that they mixed it in with tourism. Because apparently the national pharmaceutical companies were saying they wouldn't come in here because we were passing this bill. They wouldn't come in for conventions and whatever. And, first of all, we tried to deal with that by saying any activity at a convention was exempt from the bill. But that wasn't good enough, And as far as I was concerned, they were trying to hold us hostage. And I think I used that word when the vote came up in council that day. But they were successful. They worked hard at it, and it was a frustrating thing because I didn't understand. Obviously we have gotten criticized over the years for saying you're not doing enough on the opioid and the addiction problem. I don't know necessarily that criticism was fair because I think a lot of the problem is beyond what city council can do. But here we did have a way of addressing at least a piece of the problem. If you might remember when I spoke that day, I said there's an average of 100 people that wind up at the city morgue every month dying from some kind of addiction, opioid or other problem. And I said, even if we took 5 or 10 of those people out of that mix, out of that problem, isn't it worth it to just say to a doctor, you can't take a gift from a pharmaceutical rep. You can still talk to them. You can still have whatever communication you want. You just can't take a gift. And I to this day, I'm still dismayed and really kind of shocked that bill did not pass city council.
Do you think there's still a need, council member, for this kind of legislation in the interest of public health, maybe something similar, maybe identical. Do you think another council member could or should take up the mantle that you worked with Councilmember Bass so hard to push forward?
Yeah, I still think it's a sensible bill, and I think it will have an effect on the problem. Again, I never said this was a solution to the problem, because I think something like the opioid addiction and addiction generally doesn't get solved with one bill, and it doesn't get solved in one entity, whether it be city council, the state, the feds, whatever. But I think it gave us a chance to do something and have at least somewhat of an impact. We could debate how impactful it was, but it would certainly have some impact. So to answer your question, yeah, I would like to see. And Councilwoman Bass and I talked about reintroducing it, but it just, the odds that we'd be able to do it with all the other stuff going on, I think just wasn't, at least I felt we'd probably, we're not going to be able to get it done right now. But I think it is something that should be revisited, and obviously the councilwoman's going to be back next time, so, I think it's something that I think deserves another shot, yes.
What advice would you give either Bass or another council member who reintroduced the bill?
That's a good question. I guess just keep trying to state the facts, and that was our biggest thing, that there was so much misinformation. I think I called it another word on the floor that day. Misinformation given out, and I will admit sometimes it had us a little back on our heels. Like, we were not expecting, like, the Restaurant Association to come in and say how it was going to ruin restaurants because these conventions were not going to come in and all the money they were going to lose. And it's like, my God, really? So I guess the biggest advice is learn from the last time and just be as prepared as you can. But it's not going to be easy, because I don't think all that lobbying effort will not happen again. Because and I think what was the issue here was pretty much what we were doing, at least in the combination of things, no other government entity had done. So I think I think the pharmaceutical companies, by the way, that got me too. They're not exactly a well-regarded institution these days. So I guess I was surprised how many people listen to them. But anyway. You win some, you lose some. I guess we've won more than others, but that was frustrating. There's no doubt about that.
So not to leave us on a downer, I want to say something, just point of personal privilege. Yeah. Having watched you for the last 5 years, and even just listening to these questions, there's a strong sense of fairness that undercurrents the kinds of legislation you introduced and got passed in council, and I think that's important. But also a strong sense of empathy, and I don't think that something can be taught. I think you just kind of have to come into the body, being able to put yourself in the shoes of other Philadelphians. What do you think, Joe?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, as usual, Patty kind of beat me to it, and that's my compliment to my co-host. Where does that come from? And you're leaving, and there's great council people here, but council is going to lose a special quality that you have. Patty, of course, just put a light on it. Take a minute here. Tell us where it comes from. Where does your sense of empathy, where does your sense of fighting for the little guy and the working people of this city, where does it come from?
Well, I think that is something that's sort of in you, and I always think government is about, Patty used the word fairness. I think that if there was one word that government should be, it's fair, and I think, a lot of legislation we've tried to do here has been about fairness. But I think certainly spending 26 years with Councilman David Cullen had a lot to do with it, because he certainly felt that government was there to help people and that we were public servants. And, a lot of what I did over those years was working with him was basic constituent services. But I always felt that really groomed me to understand what the average person was about, because that's who called here. Called our office was the average person with, sometimes a major problem, sometimes with a small problem, but it showed that, and Councilman Cullen felt this way, every problem was important because it was important to that person that called. So certainly working with him I like to think it was in me anyway, but it certainly strengthened it. And being his quote unquote replacement, although I always said you can't replace him, when I won the special election, I wanted to, and not that we agree on everything, or the way we do it. I like the kid that Dave had no problems with burning bridges down and building them back up. I try not to burn them down. But that was his style. I have a little bit different one. And, but, I think the basic, it's about helping people, I think, and, sort of the way I got raised too. But I think certainly it got strengthened working for Councilman Cohen those 26 years.
26 years. And so thank you so much, Councilman.
Sure.
On January 6, 2020, you get to sleep in for the first time in a long time.
Yes.
As we swear in a new council. You will be missed. I know that a lot of people here agree with me. Even on the small things, the legislation, obviously, but the small things, as a parliamentarian and knowing the rules of council, it's going to be hard to replace you. We always know who to ask. Thank you, Councilman.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Sure, thank you.
Visit our website, phlcouncil.com, where you can subscribe to this show, get contact information for each council office, learn more about our legislation, and find dates for upcoming hearings and meetings. Follow us on social media. We're PHL Council on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you enjoyed this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Inside PHL Council is produced by Philadelphia City Council. This episode is adjourned to the call of the next upload. Thanks for listening.